Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming to a meeting of the Harbor Development Committee for our October meeting. An important meeting because we are going to be discussing a topic that we've been working on for several years and most recently very hard for several months. So I want to call the meeting to order. We knew that two members of our committee were not going to be able to make it, and we have texted two others who will be joining us. We are taking no votes in the public portion of the session, so I think we can proceed, and we'll defer any discussion of the only vote we were going to take was the approval of the minutes from our last meeting. So I want to thank particularly HCAM for being here and for being willing to televise this or capture it on film for delayed broadcast so that the presentations this evening regarding the town wharves can be understood and seen in retrospect by both voters and citizens and members of the advisory committee and others. I do want to thank representatives from the Historic Commission, Historic Districts Commission, the Planning Department of the town, and the Conservation Commission, all of whom are here. We had invited them, and this is a topic, our main discussion item this evening is a topic that reaches out to all of those town-related boards. So, calling to order, we're going to get started. If you'll forward the slide. Go back one. So our agenda calls for minutes, which I'm going to defer. We'll talk through the open issues, the principal one of which is 3A, the town wharf proposal, and research and analysis and discussion. And then Chris Daly, who's here to my right, representing the Bathing Beach Trustees, will update us briefly on what's happening at the bathing beach. We do have there is a CPC meeting this evening, and Harbor Development Committee and the Bathing Beach Trustees have an article, proposed article, grant request into CPC, and we'll speak about that when that arrives. Whether Ken Corson, our harbor master, is able to join us this evening, I'm not sure, had not heard from him. And we also will cover a discussion that the Historical Commission wants to bring before us regarding potential placement of the Melville Gardens gazebo, which has been the subject of some conversation in town prior to this evening. So that's the agenda. We're going to kick it off with with item 3A, the town wharf discussion. So I'm going to start this off. This will be a two-part discussion. Those who are watching, maybe we can adjust the lights. Andrea, can we tune those down a little bit? Roger, you may know how to do this. Oh, good. I think that works. I can see, and I think the audience can see. And please move to seats where you can see comfortably. The question of the town wharves is something that we have been considering now for about 5 years. And I wanted to give a bit of an overview and context before we hear from our consultant, Beals and Thomas. Eric Loss is here with us this evening, as is Roger Fernandes, the town engineer. Roger and the Harbor Development Committee have been working closely with Beals and Thomas, and tonight will be, as I said, a two-part presentation, initially by me and then by Eric. So when we talk about the town wharves, the town-owned wharves, I'm going to be pointing with a pointer that the television audience will not be able to see, but just for those who are in the room. This is Town Pier, which is the subject of our first efforts. Whitney Wharf is here with the new bridge going across. Then we have the Veterans Memorial Park, where particularly the Vietnam Vet Memorial is. The site of the former mobile station, which is an open parcel at this time. And finally, Barnes Wharf, which is the home of Hingham Maritime. Those are the four town-owned wharfs. That's distinct from John Kenny's marina operation right here. That's privately owned, as is the marina operation that Nick Bond operates from behind Red Eye Roasters. So we will not be talking about those parcels because they are not town-controlled. Next slide, Deirdre. So why worry about this? You know, what is it about the wharves and the seawall that should be of interest? Well, when we started this, I want to say 3-4 years ago, our principal focus was on the declining condition of the wharves. You can see that most pointedly in Steamboat Wharf, which I didn't mention. It was the last one on the right. It is the most deteriorated. It is the least used. A few fishermen go out, but that's pretty much it. At one point, Hingham Maritime was considering a possible use of that wharf and leasing from the town, but at this point they have not. What happens over time is storms gouge out the fill material behind the big granite stones that we think of as being so characteristic and picturesque for the town. And then as that back material disappears, the next storm with heavy waves and high tides just begins to topple those stones. And we've actually seen that in the case of Steamboat Wharf, and we've been concerned about deteriorating conditions at the other 4 wharves that I just pointed out to you. The second layer here, though, comes along when we make reference to this term called resiliency, making the wharves more resilient against flood protection from sea level rise and storm events. Here we're drawing into the discussion the whole matter of climate change and how that will translate into increased tide levels on a mean high tide basis, let alone on a high tide with a storm and storm surge and waves. But this is a topic that has become very timely. You've seen articles perhaps in the Boston Globe about a Boston Harbor-wide approach, but Hingham can't necessarily wait for that. So we have been pursuing the topic of sea level rise and resiliency right here with your Harbor Development Committee. So we are interested in reducing the risk to public safety, particularly, and to the infrastructure and property that stands, if you will, behind these wharves. We'll talk, and I'll show you some slides that give you a flavor for the degree to which these wharves represent a bulwark against sea level rise that is protecting now those both private and public property of the town. We are also interested in anything that we do, thinking hard about the character of our waterfront. Hingham is an old seaport town. That's part of our history. The Heritage Museum just opened. The first exhibit was Bucket Town. We exported buckets. All of those went from ships leaving from these wharves that we are now talking about. How do you balance whatever we may need to do to rectify the deteriorating condition and address sea level rise, while at the same time maintaining a sense of the history of our waterfront? And finally, obvious in any of this is any work we're going to do on the wharves is going to cost money. The question is whose money and how much. We're in, at this point, the how much in terms of working with our consultant to develop proposals, alternatives for addressing both the deteriorating condition and the sea level rise. Then we will begin to explore the possible funding alternatives, whether that's state, federal, or town. So to give you a flavor for why this is becoming more interesting, I've got a series of about 6 slides here that just give you a sense of some of these wharves that we know, but not everyone sees them in these conditions. I've selected 5 or 6 different displays that give you a sense. This is Town Pier and Iron Horse Park in the middle of a snowstorm, a bad snowstorm in 2016, February of 16. You see that the top of the wharf to the right is totally overflooded. This is water here that's come from the sides. That's from Nick Bond's property. And here's our Iron Horse and our rider, but he's quickly having water up to his knees. Next, please. This is that same wharf, Town Pier, now from the front, showing the Iron Horse is to our back. Town Pier would be right about here. And you see that the top of the wall has been, the expression, Eric, I think, is o'ertopped or the tide is overreached. And this is a flat tide, not a lot of waves here, not a lot of wind. Next slide. This is the same for a king tide. King tide happens twice a year. This is October of 16. This was the highest point of the regular cycle of high tides. It happened to be a very calm day. You just saw how close we are to being kind of right at the edge of what normal tides, let alone storm tides or sea level rise going from here forward, might mean. Next slide, please. Another wharf that matters to a lot of people is Barnes Wharf. This is Barnes Wharf, where Hingham Maritime resides. Their main building is just to the left behind this boat. Their pavilion where they have their classes and so forth is here. You see that this is a photo that I took last winter in the middle of a snowstorm. There's about a foot to go before the top of the wall will be breached, and waves and water will be over it. This is the pier of which Hingham Maritime is exploring constructing a major new rowing facility. There's the beginnings of a fundraising drive to build that facility. The town has entered into a contingent 30-year lease with Hingham Maritime, so they care pretty deeply about what happens to sea levels on this pier and what changes the town might consider as they proceed with their activity on this new building. Next slide. Just to give you a sense of a couple of other locations, this is the Rotary. This is not it was not the king tide, it was a normal tide. Oh, I'm sorry, that's right, this one is the king tide, October of 16. So you see we've got 3 or 4 feet before. The Rotary is slightly higher, but you see as you go down toward other portions, we just don't have that kind of protection. Next. These are 2 photos of 2 of the other wharves that we've talked about. The Mobile Station parcel is to the left. It really is a function of what the town did when we acquired the parcel. Basically, we had some rough sort of stone riprap. We put that down. There is not the kind of defined large pieces of granite that make up this wall. Same for the Veterans Park to the right. The building behind is the Fruit Center. This is the Veterans Park parking lot. And you see it's kind of rough stone, condition not terrific. Next. So what I hope that does is to give you a sense, not so much of the current condition. We've had prior meetings where we discussed the condition of these wharves based on some work that Beals and Thomas has done, and I'll describe that briefly. But I just want to give you a sense of, well, why is all of this important as it relates to the sea level rise discussion? This is a slide from Kleinfelder's June 2015 report to the town. This is a study commissioned by the then conservation officer and the Conservation Commission, looking at sea level rise across the whole town, not just this downtown parcel, but all of the town, including the Back River, Hewitt's Cove, Rockland Street, George Washington Boulevard. But what we're focusing on tonight is the 2 parcels, or the 2 sections that Kleinfelder identified here, 620 feet long between roughly Town Pier and the Mobile Station parcel, and another 430 feet from the back of a real estate office and going past the Rotary and then out on to Barnes Wharf, which is the home of Hingham Maritime. These are the 2 locations, 2 of the many locations that Kleinfelder identified as being vulnerable as near medium-term segments that are subject to significant impacts by sea level rise. Just to orient you, the other two sections, this is Route 3A going past the bathing beach with the marsh that is called Governor Long Meadow behind. There's not much infrastructure. There's some housing going on to Fearing Road down here. The other section that they've highlighted is this section, which is between the bathing beach and the lobster pound. This is going into Bear Cove and ultimately into the marsh that is a challenge for a foster school, for example, if sea level rise were dramatic. So next slide. So this is a tough one to see, but I want to try to give you a sense of, this was, again, a slide out of the Kleinfelder report saying under two different conditions, a 1% annual probability, which means once in 100 years, they would expect with SLR, sea level rise, and SS, storm surge, that once in 100 years we would see flooding in the areas shown at the level, I think yellow is 1.5 feet, and pink is 6 inches, so it's a half a foot as I recall. So that's in their mind, in focusing on 2030, they looked at and gave us back a report that gave commentary on two timetables. One was 2030, one was 2070. We are working principally with the 2030 levels, as Kleinfelder had recommended. It's not that they don't think we should be looking as far ahead as 2070, but they were very forthright in saying, look, the probabilities become much less concrete. You're looking out 45 or 50 years as opposed to 2030, which is only 13 years away. Similarly, the one on the right is a 0.2%, so that's 0.2%, which would happen every 500 years. And you see that the size of the yellow has increased, and so has the pink, and so has the inundation from other in other locations along the waterfront. But again, we're looking at the town wharves from here, Town Pier, Veterans Park, the mobile station. Not shown is Barnes Wharf. All of these feed into these areas, going up Water Street, going into the parking lot that is the old Station Street parking lot. These are areas that matter to the town. A lot of private assessed value and infrastructure and considerable public infrastructure as well. Next slide. Finally, on this sort of context, this was a graphic that Kleinfelder included, just showing again on the 100-year for 2030, 1% probability, every 100 years we would have a storm that might look like this, where the section, this is from in front of the Fruit Center, looking toward Stars on your left and Red Eye Roasters on your right, and water has come up and crossed Route 3A. Cars are traveling through it. They also included elsewhere in their materials a slide showing for 2070, and I didn't choose to do that because I thought it was a little bit of a scare tactic, and it showed water up at the level of the window of these cars. So with the again projections for how much water sea level could increase by 2070, it could be far more dramatic. So the kinds of things that we do worry about, not everyone is aware that right there, back up just a second, right about around this corner in the Station Street parking lot is this structure, which is the pump station for the North Sewer District, principal pump station for the North Sewer District. Roger, you can clarify if I'm incorrect in that. Point is, this is NAVD, the 9.3 feet here, is a standard measure of height of tides. It doesn't matter whether it's mean low, mean high, it's the universal measure. And this is 9.3 feet. Town pier is 7.2 feet. So this is 2 feet higher, but if you're looking at sea level rise and the order of magnitude that Kleinfelder was talking about, and the possibility for flooding coming directly across 3A or through the town marshes, what do we call that parcel off Water Street to the left?
Home Meadows.
The Home Meadows. Their report showed the possibility that, you know, a facility like this could get hit from the backside. So hope that gives you some context, some pictures. Some of these we've included in some of the town meeting requests that we've made. I'm going to speak to those now. This gives you a sense of what has the town been doing, what has the Harbor Development Committee been doing, and what has advisory and the voters been agreeing to. You go back to 2003, that's when Whitney Wharf was acquired in a land swap, and we rebuilt the wharf totally. I will tell you happily that wharf stands at, I think, 11.3 feet in AVD, so it's roughly 4 feet higher than Town Pier. 2013, Coastal Zone Management did a major inventory of infrastructure, not just for the town, but really a lot of eastern Massachusetts. We were included. We had access to that, and it began to give rise to the concerns about the condition of the town piers that do protect us from sea level rise. 2015 is when this report that I've shown several pages from this evening, the Kleinfelder report, was the work was done. There were several hearings, meetings with the Conservation Commission. There are a number of different bodies in the town thinking through the impacts of what that study had to say, but we are certainly one of them, and that's part of our responsibility. In 2015, we asked for the first funding for this whole effort, and the town approved that. That allowed us to go forward to have Beals and Thomas and Eric Loss do a structural assessment of all of the town-owned wharves along the entire waterfront, which I've just reviewed with you, and a survey, literally for every 25 feet, as I recall, Eric, so that we have a very good sense for what is the condition of the existing wharves, where do they need to be repaired, and then the question goes to how should we repair them, and if we're going to repair them, don't we need to address resiliency, sea level rise as well. There was some money allowed in that for potential repair, but initially it was just the visual assessment and some level of work to do borings and test pits to test soil conditions, but only for a very limited number of wharves. 2016, that visual structure was completed. Last summer, Harbor Development Committee spent several meetings, including a meeting with the advisory committee and the selectmen, to go through our decision, our recommendation that we should prioritize Town Pier first. We did that. That led to Beals and Thomas proceeding to do exactly the kind of borings and test pits of soil conditions and materials underneath these wharves. These wharves are 100 and sometimes over 100 years old. Sometimes they were built, very carefully and with good substructure, and sometimes we have the sense that they may have been built over a very rough base. So that's what these borings and test pits are intended to do. Finally, at last year's town meeting, we had said, as part of when we prioritized Town Pier, we told the advisory committee and the selectmen and ultimately the voters, look, Town Pier and these other three wharves, Veterans Park, Mobile, and Barnes, are all in not dissimilar condition. It isn't enough to just do this further engineering assessment and design and permitting for just Town Pier. We really should be addressing, all four of the town-owned wharves. And I'm pleased to say, once again, that the voters, advisory committee, selectmen and the voters supported that and gave us $240,000. Contract was let in August, and Beals and Thomas is beginning that work. They've already done their borings on Hingham Maritime Center because they're about to take their wharves and put them up on top of the Maritime Center wharf, and they needed to do the borings when there was nothing there. So that has begun, and Eric will update us a little bit on that. So that leads us to tonight. We're here as the logical next step of the process that I've just walked you through on that prior page. We will get into some discussion of alternative designs. We did have one meeting a month ago when our committee for the first time heard any of this. Eric came and presented to us. There was good give and take. There were questions raised. We know there'll be questions from other town bodies and or just citizens. And it's our job, from my perspective, to be a sounding board to raise some of those questions initially and get the conversation started. The third bullet, I emphasize what I've characterized as, this is the marriage of two different things that are two different events. We started with a focus on repairing the wharves, and in the middle of that evolution, the whole question of sea level rise became just that much more important for New England, for Massachusetts, and for this town, evidenced by the Kleinfelder report, which does feed a lot of our subsequent discussions. So we will hear from Beals and Thomas about their recent work. The key discussion that we want to engage the town in, and I have written a commentary piece that I think will be in this week's Hingham Journal that frames this question and says, look, as a town, we have to kind of decide what is our risk tolerance for flooding from sea level rise and storm surge. Major storms like Hurricane Sandy, we missed a bullet with Jose and Maria, but who knows when the next hurricane that really could hit our town badly might occur. And what we're trying to do as we look to repair these ancient wharves is also address the question of how do we deal with climate change as part of that conversation. So the primary end point of that is what resiliency wharf height should we recommend and discuss with the advisory committee, with the selectmen and the voters, and move forward, because without that, Eric and Beals and Thomas really can't go forward to their next step, which is to begin to design potential sea level rise mediation. I will say, the last bullet there is that one thing that has become clear to us in our conversations over the last month or 6 weeks is that we had the town engineer, Roger Fernandes, who's here, and his assistant, Tom Molinari, go out and take heights of each of the structures in the town. Every single structure that we have, including the new Armistone wall at the bathing beach, including the new sand dune that we have installed and the interlocking concrete granite that's beneath it that is protecting the bathing beach parking lot, including all of the town-owned piers, even including the parcels that we don't own, because we are mindful that, of course, if there was a major flood event, we'd have to worry about what Mr. Kenny or what Mr. Bond were doing with their properties. So we'll look at that tonight, and you'll get a chance to see that. But what's becoming evident, I think, to the committee, some consensus developing, is that whatever height, going back to resiliency wharf height, whatever wharf height we choose, it seems to make sense that we should be thinking about selecting that height for each of the 4 town-owned wharves. And as it happens, that's roughly similar to where Whitney Wharf is, which I told you was higher, was rebuilt most recently, and the heights along the bathing beach, the front of the parking lot, and the Armorstone wall. So it would give us, it seems to be a logical objective that we should be at a consistent height for whatever we are doing with respect to reconstruction and raising of the town piers. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Eric for his report, and then circle back. We will have time for questions from any here, and I encourage them, because this is the opportunity. This is our major agenda item, and I'm happy to take the time. Eric, we're going to let you get yours up on the screen and join us. So while he's doing that, I'll just mention Eric Loss has been with Beals and Thomas many years, but has been with us and the town for, I would say, at least the last 4 or 5. Beals and Thomas has been involved in the work at Whitney Wharf and the design of the bridge, and all of this work on surveys. So his firm knows us well, and that's in fact why we chose them to continue this work, because their knowledge base at this point is very high. Eric, it's over to you. And Bob, you'll pick up Eric, right?
Good evening. Thank you, Bill. My name is Eric Lass, professional engineer and principal with the engineering firm Beals and Thomas. As Bill noted, we have been working with the town for a number of years on a variety of projects. I appreciate the thorough introduction and context that Bill gave. At this point, I'd like to switch over to more of the technical aspects of the coastal wharf resiliency project, discuss that in more detail in terms of where we are at this point now. There's been a lot of data gathering, research, and study that's been done by our firm as well as other consulting firms to this point. But now we're at a point where we really are looking for more direction from the town so that we can continue our design development and really move towards being able to put these projects out for bid so that these improvements can be constructed, hopefully in the relatively near future. So in order to be able to move forward, there's a number of factors that we're looking at to really narrow and focus our design direction going forward. As Bill had noted, the town has already established 2030 as the year for future sea level rise. That's going to be the basis of the criteria that we use in our design analysis. We're trying to gain a better understanding of the town's tolerance for flood frequency and resulting damage. As Bill had mentioned, there's the commonly referred to as the 100-year and the 500-year storms. The 100-year storm has a 1% chance of happening in any given year. It's not to say that it will only happen once every 100 years. It's that in any given year, there's a 1% chance. You could have a scenario where you could have 2 100-year events 5 or 7 years apart even. It's really a percentage. And that's important for the town to understand what those risk levels are. As Bill had noted, there's critical infrastructure, public and private infrastructure associated with the Inner Harbor area as these wharves overtop during significant storm events. There's loss of service, direct damage caused by that flooding, and then the cost to repair that. We're also very highly and keenly aware of the aesthetic impacts of this project on the historic Inner Harbor area. As we get into talking about increasing wall heights in different scenarios, it may be easy to say, well, we'll raise the walls, several feet, but that has a real impact on how the waterfront will look. And in addition to that, there's also the cost to implement these improvements as well that we're focusing on at this point. So over the past year, we've done a number of subsurface investigations focused on Town Pier and Barnes Wharf, geotechnical borings that were done on the pier. We've done test pits on the piers as well, and also in front of the walls at low tide. We've been able to go out and see what the soils are on the wharves and in front of them, underneath them. It's really important because if we look to build these walls up, we really need to know how the foundations are and how the geotechnical factors come in to play with any of the design scenarios. There may be limits on what we can actually do based upon the existing conditions that are in place at the different wharves at this point. This fall, before the end of the year, we're also focusing on additional subsurface investigations at Veterans Park and the former mobile station sites as well, and we're hoping to have those in progress over the next few weeks as well. And this data is going to be the final piece in really giving us all the background that we need to be able to move forward with our design. We've already done surveys of the wharves on land, as well as bathymetric surveys in the water, combined with this geotechnical information and our visual structure assessments that we did between 2015 and 2016. This next graphic was prepared by the town engineer's office. We've been working very closely with the town engineer's office on these projects. This presentation this evening is a direct collaboration. What this graphic depicts on the left side are some of those future sea level rise scenarios that Bill had referred to earlier. Starting on the leftmost side of the screen, those two upper columns are the 2070 scenarios. Again, the degree of certainty associated with that is less certain than the 2030 scenarios, which are the next two columns. And that is really, those are the elevations that we're most closely focusing on. And that is an elevation of 10.2. That's the 100-year storm event with no waves. So that would be a 1% chance storm in the year 2030. Then we have, as we continue across this graphic, what we now have are all of the existing structures that are essentially town-owned, starting on the western side of the inner harbor. Just past the bathing beach, there's an armor stone wall, which is this item here. And then we're going to work across the slide heading eastward through the inner harbor. We have the bathing beach and the new armor stone wall and dune there. This is a proposed structure, the bathing beach as well. Then we have Town Pier, which we've been discussing and focusing on with the elevation 7.2. Bill had noted. Here's Whitney Wharf as well, and you can see relative, and that's the good thing about this is that the right side of this column is the structure heights, and you can see them as you look across relative to each other, and that's really why this was pulled together, is so that it's easy to see the difference in the structure heights, and you can see how much lower the Town Pier is relative to these new projects that were more recently done in the past couple of years at the bathing beach area, as well as Whitney Wharf done prior to that. So these are up, over that elevation 10.2 that we see here. But Town Pier, most notably, as well as Barnes Wharf, which we also discussed, and Veterans Park and the former mobile station. They're all, these are the four lowest town-owned wharves in the inner harbor, and they're significantly lower than the structures that have been more recently improved. So here's Town Pier, just an aerial exhibit. Over the past year, we worked closely with the HDC in evaluating our starting point, essentially. Which wharf did we want to start at and prioritize? and that was selected as town pier. Since that time, we've also focused on Barnes Wharf, former mobile station, and Veterans Park, and those are underway as well. But town pier continues to be our starting point and where we're going to be designing our improvements first and foremost. So north is up on this image here at Route 3A, Red Eye Roasters. Here's Iron Horse Park, Town Pier, Whitney Wharf. This is the new Whitney Wharf pedestrian bridge, the boat ramp, and the bathing beach to the left of this. There's some interesting aspects to the town pier. The elevation of this area where the Iron Horse statue is quite notably a lot higher than the surrounding area. There's this area of parking along 3A, this vegetated strip here. There's quite a high hedgerow just off the edge of this parking. Some of the photos that Bill had showed earlier, portions of the outer edge of this wharf are already inundated under seasonal high tides, let alone storm surge and future sea level rise scenarios. But as I'll get into, as we look more closely at design alternatives here, there may not be necessarily just a solution that happens right at the face of the wall and at the water's edge. There's essentially a lot of space to perhaps break up that vertical additional elevation we're trying to add into perhaps two different segments. Maybe a couple of feet at the waterfront, perhaps a couple more feet set back from that, or perhaps it's set back as far as this hedgerow here. Those are all things that we're going to be evaluating as we move forward, but what we really need is the town to decide what critical design elevation they want to aim for, and then we will work our design alternatives around that critical elevation. This is another graphic that was prepared by the town engineer's office. As you really get into it, this is an extremely helpful tool for looking at possible increases in wall heights to provide additional resiliency in different storm scenarios. So there's two axes here. The bottom, the x-axis. This is the different storm events. So we heard reference earlier to the 500-year, the 0.2% storm, the 100-year, the 1% storm, on down 50, 20, 10, and the 5-year storm, which has a 20% chance of happening in any given year. So right now, town pier, the average elevation there is at 7.2. That's essentially representative of this axis right down at the bottom. There's green lines and yellow lines. The green lines on this chart are 2017. That's current conditions. The yellow is the 2030 scenario that we're looking to design towards. And that difference between the solid green and the solid yellow, as you look at this, is sea level rise. That's what makes up that difference there. And what this is showing is that if we were to look at a 2-foot increase, so increasing town pier, any shape or form, just increasing the average elevation of town pier by 2 feet up to 9.2. Essentially what this helps show us is what storm events town pier and the landward infrastructure of that would be protected to. So everything below the red line is essentially protected. So if we were to add 2 feet today onto town pier, without wave effect, but just a future 500-year storm event without wave action would not overtop with a 2-foot increase. But in 2030, it would overtop by a foot. So even with 2 feet of additional added height. Then when you add on or look at adding waves onto that, the federal agency FEMA uses a 4-foot wave height in this area. That may seem high based upon kind of just visual observations, but again, you have to think these are significant and storm events. So that's what the upper dashed lines on here show. That's when you factor in not only the tide itself and the storm surge itself, but waves on top of that. You really get quite a bit higher. So that's an additional consideration for the town as they try to pick an elevation that we'll design for. So I'm going to move on to the next slide, which is there's 3 slides in total as we look at different wall heights. So if we add 3 feet to the existing average elevation, now we look at that same 500-year or 0.2% chance storm. In the year 2030, now the water would be at the top of the wall, not necessarily overtopping it. If you add waves on top of that, yes, the wall would be overtopped, but just in terms of the sea level rise and storm surge, with a 3-foot increase up to elevation 10.2, the town would have protection there at Town Pier up to the 500-year or the 0.2% chance storm. So as we continue moving up in elevation, there's additional protection that's happening that accounts for future sea level rise and significant future storms. Just one last scenario we looked at. This would be a dramatic change to the waterfront. This would be a 6-foot increase in wall height. But we wanted to see what even adding 6 feet on would provide for protection to the town. And looking at the year 2030, even with waves and a 500-year event, that wall could overtop, even with 6 feet of additional increase in height. But there would be several feet of protection in terms of just a more normal still water storm surge only elevation. So as we're looking at and considering aesthetics and costs, we don't foresee a 6-foot increase being practical as we're considering possible design alternatives. So 6 to 7 foot increase, we already recognize that that's just not going to be realistic given the dramatic impact that would have on the waterfront, the look of it, the use of it. But there is a middle ground there. And that's what we're really trying to narrow down and focus on, whether it's 3 feet or 4 feet or 2.5. That's what we're looking for the town to decide on. We'll be able to advance our design, consider landward flood protection options. Again, if we're trying to increase or add 3 feet of vertical elevation, we don't make it all up right at the face of the wall, and then it's done in two parts with an offset wall, having a retaining wall back. Further, proposed harbor walk, also just considering modular and or temporary barriers. Modular meaning maybe improvements that are actually permanent but could be added onto in future years in the same location. Design for that and plan for that now would be future cost savings, and as sea levels rise towards that 2070 scenario, it would be great to have a design that could be built upon in future years if it became necessary. Now, landward options may not be feasible at all locations along the inner harbor, and we may need to just, in fact, raise the walls themselves, but we're going to be looking at at multiple options. And then on top of that, there are wall repairs that are also going to be needed as part of these projects. It's one thing to add on to them, but we have to make sure that they're structurally sound and they're going to be in good operating condition as well. This graphic here, there's a lot of information. There's two parts to this. Again, this is depicting the level of detail that Beals and Thomas is looking at each of the wharves, and this is Town Pier. We just took two cross sections starting out in the water. The inset here going back to 3A. So we have the water side on the left, 3A all the way to the right. This is a cross section through the wharf down at the west end. We've done another one down below at the east end. And what we're seeing here is the fact that grade-wise, elevation-wise, 3A is quite a bit higher than the edge of Town Pier at the water. And this is what has led us to visualize potentially having improvements that happen right at the water's edge, but also potentially set back where we can take advantage of natural changes in topography to implement improvements at a much lower cost than trying to raise these walls all right up at the water's edge, which is quite expensive to do that. So we have these same sections for Barnes Wharf, for Veterans Park, and for Mobile Station as well. But I just selected these from Town Pier as a representation of what we've been looking at. As I noted, really the critical design and the additional protection that will offer is first and foremost, but then, close second, very close second, if not tied, is the aesthetic impact on the waterfront. There's two different types of construction, so even once we pick or decide upon a preferred design elevation, and as we evaluate different options, there's types of construction, whether it's vertical granite walls or options which may be less costly, cast in place walls, sheet pile walls, but may not have the same aesthetic, certainly, that we'll have to consider in ultimately selecting a final design. So coming up with the design elevation is really just the first part. Then we'll be focusing on these other aspects as we develop our design. And my final two slides here that I'll be presenting, just want to reiterate that for us to continue to our design process and meet the town's criteria, balancing flood protection, aesthetics, and cost, while retaining the character of the waterfront, we need the town to decide on an elevation that's going to balance levels of risk, future storm scenarios, and sea level rise. Then we'll prepare design alternatives based upon that. And the way we see this moving forward is that the HDC ultimately recommend critical design elevation to the selectmen and to Beals and Thomas in terms of the wall height increase. Then we'll design around that elevation with different alternatives relating to the type of construction, cost, and aesthetics. Based upon those different alternatives, the HDC, the town engineer, will identify preferred recommendation, present that to advisory committee, and then ultimately to the Board of Selectmen for a vote. And with that, this last slide here, I will turn back over to Bill.
Actually, I'm going to ask you, Eric, if you would flip back to the slide that showed the heights of the various structures on the wharf with the blue, about 5 back. That one. So I wanted to emphasize the point that I made at the end of my comments, that one of the things that seems to begin to be clear from the Harbor Development Committee's perspective is that the 4 wharves that I described to you and showed to you earlier, Town Pier, Veterans Park, Mobile Station, and Barnes, and remember that in the case of Barnes Wharf, we have an agreement with the Hingham Maritime Center that we are responsible for the wharf and for its repair, and they are responsible for going out and raising the money and constructing this new rowing center. And there are contingency elements to that agreement that say that each of the parties is going to move forward on both of these fronts kind of simultaneously and presumably march down together to a better facility for the town. But my point is, you'll notice, again, the heights here, 7.2 for Town Pier, I think it's 7.3 for Veterans Park, and similar for the Mobile Station, and very similar again for Barnes Wharf, as opposed to structures that we already have in place at Whitney Wharf and the Bathing Beach. So my point in terms of a consistent approach is that it strikes us, we may be starting with Town Pier, but we ought to be moving toward a decision on a recommended storm surge height that would be presumably consistent across all 4 of those town-owned wharves. So look, what I want to do at this point is open the field for questions, particularly from members of the Hingham professional staffs. There will be, of course, other opportunities. Eric, I'm going to ask one other thing. Would you forward these slides to Roger so that Roger can then forward them to Lonnie, Andrea Young, and Mary Savage Dunham, so that they can forward it to each of their constituent, Conservation Commission, Planning Board, Historical Commission. I just think in terms of people can watch this program on a retrospective basis thanks to HCAM, but to have the slides in front of them as they're doing that would be certainly helpful. So I'm hoping that's something you might be willing to do.
Yes, absolutely. As we've done with our previous presentations to HDC, all those presentations are available to the town.
Okay. So, Mary, Lonnie, Lucy, I know Andrea had to go down to CPC, so we won't have questions from them, but, and I realize you can't speak for your commissions, but nonetheless, you are their representatives. Are there questions? And I decided it made sense to go through this, entirely and then come back to questions rather than interrupt as we went along. But do either of you or Lucy have questions in terms of town, or is this something that you really need some time to consider, think about, perhaps have conversations with your boards, and we can circle back? I had been thinking that it might make sense to have a town hall session, sometime during the day with each of the members of what I think of as the planning troika in the town of planning, historic, and conservation. But Lucy?
I do, but do you want to? All right.
Go ahead.
I guess I should do this, right?
Yes.
Yeah, sure.
I think you'll need to go there. Bob, you can pick these up, I assume.
This is sort of a...
You want to just identify yourself for the...
Lucy Hancock, Advisory Committee, Hingham. Kind of logistical questions, looking at these 4 wharves, looking at the possibilities. How soon will we have a proposal ready to go to town meeting? Is this an ATM 2018? And the second part of the question is, you've been using mooring fees, I believe, for a lot of the work so far. Have you had fund balance? I'm trying to remember what we did last year.
I think most of this has come from the reserved mooring fee funds.
Okay, and the anticipation is that there'll be enough mooring fee income in the future to pay for all this work, or you don't know?
You're going into the question that is the last slide that I have not yet put up.
Then let's go back to logistics, and what's the timing for getting something done, and how many wharves?
But that's included too, in my last slide. So I'm more interested in what has been presented rather than what has yet to be presented.
Okay.
So if you have questions on the materials that Eric and I have rolled out, I'd like to hear about those first.
Not really.
Okay? I mean, it's a lot. I should be forthright with all in the room and with the public. This is a thorny, pretty technical issue, and we have, as a committee, have struggled with it in terms of just getting our arms around the information. I think I've displayed it's been a thoughtful process, you know, with steps along the way, and aided significantly by our consultant, so that we have the kind of information that we and other bodies in the town need in order to be able to, you know, come to an informed decision. So if not from...
I do have one about
Sure,
what's
go ahead.
happened so far. We're talking about some sort of middle ground where we're not doing 6 feet, we're not doing 1 foot, we might be 2 or 3 feet, because of the aesthetics partially now, and also because of the risk of 30 versus 70 years. Could we build upon a 3-foot increase later without significant difference, or is there more benefit in saying, let's go the whole way and do the 6-foot increase, and it's cheaper to do it that way?
I'll let Eric answer that, because it's something we have talked about.
Yes, I think we're interested because each wharf is different, and we're working on multiple wharves at multiple times. So as Bill had noted, we're trying to be consistent in what we're designing to. So each wharf is going to have perhaps a different final design scenario, and for us to evaluate all the different options for all the different heights, it winds up being an infinite number of possibilities. So what we're trying to do is narrow down and focus on a narrower band, even if it doesn't have to necessarily be a single elevation, but at least a 1 foot range, and then we can then come back with real options that we have to do conceptual design work to be able to talk about aesthetics. We just can't jump to aesthetics and cost without really knowing what elevation we want to design to. So it's this.
Do you need all the, excuse me for a minute, Eric, HCAM, do you need the full lights up? I still wanted to be able to reference the slides.
So could you build on, let's say in 10 years, could you build on top of what you might do in the next 2 years? And major height and higher walls, for example?
There is a possibility of that.
We've talked
It's
about
a
that,
modular-
Lucy, as modular or incremental, and there certainly is interest in, and that will be part of what Beals and Thomas might come back to us with in terms of alternatives.
Okay.
I will answer your question about timing and so forth. Are there other questions from other members of the audience? Please come forward if you would. That's only so that you can be heard, and those at home, the microphone used to be up here in front of me, but it's actually better there. You can be captured. Please identify yourself if you would.
Thank you. Mike Dwyer, 56 Liberty Pole Road. Do you do that here, like town meeting? Question is, I remember being so impressed with the Kleinfelder report, but that seems to be absolutely critical in terms of, you know, the structure or projections. And I was wondering, how do those square with FEMA maps or any other sources? You know, is it relevant to think about any other readily available sources that might corroborate as we enter this design process?
I think I'll let Eric and perhaps Roger as well respond to that. I have some perspectives, but I'd rather have our professional speak first.
So one of the things that we noted, because we certainly took a close look at Kleinfelder's report, it was in place before we began our work on this project in earnest. So there's a lot of data there, but we also compared it to FEMA's data. And in terms of the slides I have with me this evening, this graphic here at Town Pier helps to depict some of those differences. And what we find is that Kleinfelder's recommended scenarios are about 6 inches in terms of sea level rise. What Kleinfelder did is in their 2030 evaluation, they essentially added a half a foot or 6 inches to the FEMA 100-year flood elevation. So Kleinfelder took FEMA's data, they looked at sea level rise, and for the year 2030, that equated to about a 6-inch, half of a foot increase. And that's what we see. The green line here is the current, today, FEMA 100-year flood. The way that FEMA happens to do their modeling, there is actually a break in their model where, right essentially at Town Pier, where there's actually a significant jump in their projected elevations by over a foot. But to keep it more basic, what Kleinfelder did essentially for the year 2030 is they took FEMA's information and added 6 inches onto that. The 2070 scenario, it's greater than that.
And do you recall, Eric, whether Kleinfelder again assumed a greater increase in 2070 than FEMA? In other words, directionally, is it the same? Or is Kleinfelder's 2070 target lower than FEMA's for 2070? Do you recall?
It is higher.
It is higher.
Because they're using FEMA as the base, and then they're adding sea level rise onto that. So the difference would be your flood. You have your storm event, which is the FEMA 100-year storm event, the 1% storm, and then you have future sea level rise on top of that.
So the other thing I would add to the response, unless, Roger, you wanted to clarify anything from the town's perspective, and again, you'd need to come up, Roger, I think, if you were going to, sorry.
The only other thing I would add is that if you, and it's on the town's website, if you were to look at the FEMA maps and the way that those elevations are established are a lot more broad, I think, than what was taking place in the Kleinfelder report. And by that, I mean, you'll see in the rendering that Eric's got up there, there's a 1-foot jump, and in what seems to be a pretty arbitrary location in a lot of the FEMA maps, even in the Inner Harbor, you'll jump from an AE, which is an area subject to inundation, to a VE, and there are different effects, a velocity zone subject to wave action, and to try to apply rhyme and reason to some of that becomes sometimes difficult. Why does that line exist here and not here? So I think that it's a useful tool to build a model, but to contrast that with what's being done here sometimes can be difficult. It's not as precise.
So along those same lines, and Roger, if you would please stay, because I think in terms of responding to Lucy, we may want to be working together. My additional response would be, I think you may recall the tension, might be the word, between the town and FEMA regarding the maps for flood zones and the impacts on insurance, flood insurance for people in the town. The difference here is that Kleinfelder is dealing with very specific Hingham data, and FEMA sometimes can take a very broad brush, and that's been, I think, the experience of this town and frankly many others. That FEMA's trying to do this at 10,000 feet, and Kleinfelder was bringing it very specifically. And in some of the diagrams that I showed this evening, and many of the others throughout their 70-plus page report, it's really detailed, and it's visual, and it's very, very helpful in terms of I would never have thought that Foster School might be an issue for sea level rise. Well, I just didn't have an understanding of the topography of the town and the way that Bear Cove, circles back. That's the kind of thing that FEMA might or might not have captured. But I sort of put more. I put more standing in Kleinfelder because I think it was specific to us. Other questions? We have a new guest who may or may not have questions, but she wasn't here for the presentation. Yes, Lonnie. Why don't you come up?
We've got a seat here.
No, yeah, okay. We just move a. Lonnie Fournier is the conservation agent for the town and works with the Conservation Commission.
So forgive me for taking the focus away from the wharves and structures that you've already discussed tonight, but since Steamboat came up before, I thought I would ask for clarification as to why it wasn't also considered. My understanding is that it is town-owned, but I believe that there's a distinction between Board of Selectmen and perhaps Conservation Commission for the ownership. So if you have clarification for that, that would be helpful.
Sure, let's see if we can position people. Here's the Rotary, here's Lincoln Maritime and Barnes, Hingham Maritime, excuse me, new name. And here is so-called Steamboat Wharf. I'm not sure, Lonnie, legally whether, I know that Barnes 1 is selectman controlled. I believe Barnes 2 or Steamboat Wharf may be as well. The fact that there was some conversation between Hingham Maritime and the town about, at one point they were thinking about having their rowing on one wharf and their sailing on the other, and they ultimately concluded it was both logistically and financially impossible to do as much work as was going to be necessary on Steamboat Wharf to proceed with that one as well. So they've put all of their energies on Barnes Wharf, which is right off the Rotary. In answer to your question why we, as a committee, focused on 4 rather than 5, because it is clear the town owns Steamboat Wharf, and it is a beautiful wharf. It's right near my home, and I was there as a child. And the difference is that in terms of the sea level rise discussion, this wall between Steamboat Wharf and Barnes Wharf is actually one of the highest structures on the whole harbor. And the fact that Summer Street, going up from the Rotary toward Nantasket, is rising quite rapidly, the potential for flooding of anything other than simply the land behind Steamboat Wharf, but not necessarily into and across the Rotary and kind of into the back through the home meadows, is significantly reduced. But Steamboat Wharf itself is not critical to our protection for sea level rise.
Okay.
I think that was our conclusion as a committee.
Okay. Did I understand you correctly earlier that Steamboat is in some deteriorating condition, though?
Steamboat I would argue, is probably in the worst condition. Eric has done the detail. If you were to kayak past or go by in a boat, you'll see some of the headstones at the top of the front of the wharf. This section right here have fallen over. They're in the harbor, and if you walk out there, there's a 5 foot gap, behind the wall where all of the stone and sand has just washed out through the chinks in the wall. Every time there's a storm with ice and waves, you have more kind of deterioration. So that one is in the worst shape from my perspective.
Okay. Thank you.
It's not that I wouldn't love to do something. I think we haven't, as a town, yet thought about, well, what's the creative use? I remember our landscape designer coming and just Google-eyed over what the potential for Steamboat Wharf, but we haven't been able to prioritize it.
Right. And so the priority for the other wharves is that it's protection of additional infrastructure, public safety infrastructure.
Exactly.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes. Again, if you'd identify yourself.
My name is Hans Vonderleft. I'm with the Historic Districts Commission.
Yes.
Work with Andrea. Great presentation. Thank you. A lot of information here. Sorry if I missed it, but can I get a clarification just on this the sea level change just from climate for 2032 and for 2070? What's kind of baked into the numbers for that on the charts? Is it, per year or per 10 years, whatever number you can give me?
Well, we're looking, so the prediction from the Kleinfelder study is that there will essentially be 6 inches of sea level rise come the year 2030. And that they have a relatively high degree of certainty with that estimate. And you can add that on to today's high tide. You can add it on to today's FEMA estimate of a 100-year storm event. It's just you're adding 6 inches onto anything in today's values relative to talking about storms, flood.
So 6 inches in 15 years, so in 2072, your out year kind of numbers, you're looking at another
It's
50 or 60 years, so another, let's call it,
But Hans, it's not linear.
it's not, so, okay.
I don't want to get into politics, and this is a very hot political topic, but the issue of climate change and the impact of melting ice cap and the causes for climate change. It depends on which group of scientists you look to, but you can't take the near term difference between now and 2030 and then say, okay, so add 40 years and just do it linearly. Most of the models, the reason why 2070 is so much higher is it's not just a linear progression. I think it's also actually based on models of accelerating sea level rise due to the climate change kinds of things that the world is worrying about.
Right, so I think I'm sure what you're going to do is take all that information into account and make a recommendation for the increase that we're going to need, so we don't have to come back to this, every 10 years and review it and review it and review it, and more cost and more cost. So it's I think it's important to kind of take a real forward look at this and combine an aesthetic solution with something that's going to work for the town and all those wharves.
It's effectively what my commentary said. Effectively, the challenge for us is to think long-term. The last time these wharves were done was 100-plus years ago.
Mm-hmm.
We'd like to think we're doing something that, would be that lengthy. Whether we're capable of doing that given current climate conditions, I'm not sure. But it is exactly that. It's balancing cost, aesthetics, and safety.
Okay, good. What are the materials that you're thinking about using here? What's on the table right now? Granite?
That's the next step, Hans. When Eric talks to us about coming to us with design alternatives, you saw a little bit about this in one of his slides, where on the left-hand side, he had traditional, our kind of granite block, solid wall. You can go to, any seaport town like Gloucester or Salem or Boston and see concrete or steel, just steel things sunk in the ground, sometimes with some sort of a facing or not. There's a whole variety of materials that could be used, and one of the discussion points, may be, does that need to be consistent for our harbor? One of the discussions that our committee had at our last meeting was, Town Pier, iconic. It's where Iron Horse is. It's where we all gather. Barnes Wharf is going to be the maritime center for the town. The Veterans Park and the mobile station, given if you're from the water, and I'm a boater, so I'm on the water rowing or sailing, Nick Bond's marina kind of goes out through there, and there are a lot of boats in front of it, and you don't have the kind of visual of those that you do of Barnes or Town Pier. Might it be possible or recommendable that we use a less costly, somewhat simpler, maybe somewhat less traditional material to achieve the resiliency objective, but perhaps not necessarily build a stone, rebuild an 18th century stone pier. We don't know. I think that's part of the discussion.
In terms of some of the analysis that you've done so far from the wave action coming in, particularly with storms, have you looked at a breakwater type solution at all with this? Is that something that's been discussed?
You're entering the world of coastal Coastal Management and the Army Corps and Department of DCR in state, they are very wary of groins and sea walls, out in the harbor. They tend to be, and Lonnie can probably speak to this better than I can. They tend to be very conservationally cautious about adding structures that might change the way tides flow and all of this. We explored that when we were looking at and actually Chris Daly for the Bathing Beach Trustees could speak to that, when we were looking at the modifications to protect the bathing beach and the grove area at the bathing beach. Could there be a wall put out into the harbor that would break the waves before of the strong action? And it's very, very difficult to do in today's regulatory environment, conservation regulatory environment.
Okay. And the other thing I would ask is, have you looked at some of the other South Shore towns that have had similar problems? What they've done, what their analysis has indicated, steps that they've taken, costs that they've incurred. Did they look at the same type of research that we're looking at and come out with, which direction did they go in? Because some other towns, I think, have some more significant problems that they've had recently, and I see some of the work that's being done, and it's
interesting.
extensive.
We are always trying to be in touch with our neighbors and with towns with a similar DNA, if you will. I became aware 2 weeks ago that I actually know the chairman of the Harbor Development Committee for Cohasset, and Cohasset has actually probably much more in terms of wharf area than Hingham does. And my guess is that their heights are not dramatically higher than Town Pier.
Yeah.
So that is a conversation we will be having. Situate has done a lot. Situate's been very successful with the state, Seaport Bond Council, broadly on the subject of access, and they have a quite dramatic marine center. Some of that's been town funded, so that they've stepped up as voters to do a number of things, and it's a very attractive harbor as well. So we are looking. It's one of the questions that we asked Eric in terms of, are you seeing other towns that are really getting into not just the repair side? Remember I said this is the marriage of two tracks here, repair and restoration on the one hand, and sea level resiliency on the other. The truth of the matter is we're probably ahead of a number of our neighbors in really thinking about the question that we're struggling with tonight, which is resiliency and what's an appropriate target. And to Lucy's question, can it be incremental? Can it be modular? These are questions. They have a long-term impact, and they have a lot of doubt, in the basic facts that surround the decision points. And so it's not an easy exercise.
Yep, I could tell. And just one follow-up on the FEMA maps. If there is a way to possibly get some assurances that after this work is done, that these maps are going to be somehow reconfigured in such a way that the different floodplains get redesignated, so that there's an insurance savings, there's a real benefit to some of the folks that are right down there in the waterfront, and Foster School, for instance, and other insurance costs we may be incurring. So if there's a way to do that where, you can get in front of this. So
I don't want to be facetious,
Yep.
but I think that's highly unlikely. I don't imagine that Beals and Thomas is going to step up and say, you can bank on this. If we raise the walls 3.5 feet, then we're good. It's a highly judgmental area. FEMA itself, to try to take them on, I mean, we did, and some towns I think have sued FEMA over some of their flood designations because of the impacts on insurance. But it's a tough area to get assurance insurance, if I can use that phrase. Hurricane Sandy, if you think back to what its impact was on New York and New Jersey, it just, rewrote a whole lot of rules for that geographic area. A similar storm, here could do the same for us, and it's very tough to be able to warrant that you'll be protected against those kinds of unforeseen events. So.
One thing I wanted to ask, though, to add, Hans, you bring up, have we looked at one of the best, closest examples to see in terms of other materials is at the Baxter Mooring and the Kenny Marina. When that wharf was reconstructed, they did it with concrete. So as you come down, heading westbound on Summer Street or in the Hingham Rotary, you can see what a concrete solution would look like vis-a-vis the more historical granite.
Right.
So we owe Lucy an answer. So Eric, could you scroll forward? Thank you, Hans, for your question. Are there any other questions? Could you scroll forward to that slide that,
Off my,
So your questions were, when will the ask be?
yeah, no, I know, but there's a slide that was at the end of Eric's presentation. Let's see if we can get that back up. So Lucy, to respond to your question as best we can, because there are perhaps at least two different scenarios that we could contemplate here. Part of the question is the timing of this very process that we're doing now. You're familiar with the term as a long time advisory committee member. We're socializing this topic. We need input. Eric clearly needs input. Harbor development is the logical place for this discussion to occur, but absolutely not, the last place for the discussion. We would hope that over the next two of our meetings, and perhaps a meeting with the selectmen, we can get to the point that Eric is looking for, where there is a recommendation that he then can turn around and begin to translate into designs, whether we select town pier first and go with that one. And then, of course, the question will be, well, what about funding this? How are we going to do that? One of the arenas that's open to us is the Seaport Economic Council. Sometimes they're called the Seaport Bond Council. They're the group that we got the money for the bathhouse snack shack. And by the way, they've told us, please don't come and talk to us before you've got that built. they want to see result. But they are clearly one venue. Obviously, the town, whether it's the general fund or a bond specific to harbor-related use. Our town administrator recently retired, Ted Alexiadis. This is a conversation that I had begun to have with Ted, and he's promised that I can speak with him in retirement to pick his brain a little more. We generate somewhere between $250,000 and $300,000 a year of mooring permit fees from boaters in this harbor that will be benefited by this work. That can support a quite substantial borrowing depending on interest rates and the term of the bond. If these are long-term infrastructure things, we bond schools for, somebody can help me, 15, 20 years. I'm not exactly sure. It's the same kind of thing. That source of revenue is one vehicle. The general fund is obviously another. We would be exploring all of those. Timing-wise, the question is, if we want to, it's a question of the cycle for the Seaport Economic Council. Roger tells me that they have one cycle that would have an application in November for consideration in January. That would be very aggressive, but sometimes it pays to ask frequently and go in a second time if at first you don't succeed. It is clear that any Seaport Council award sort of requires skin in the game by the town, just as we did with the bathhouse project. We already had committed the funds for engineering and design, and that was the basis on which we went for the $750,000 request to the bond council. So if we are to plug into a bond council cycle, certainly for 2018, or even the next application date, Roger, would be August?
August 18th?
August.
For the 19th meeting. Yeah, May 19th meeting.
You'd either, it's a question of, do you put it in 2018 as almost a pump priming fund? Because this is going to be with us a long time. This is a long-term project. Or, in other words, do you get started, or do you wait until we have something, more definitive, and some numbers that are clearer in terms of what's the end result going to be? Very early on, Eric's firm did some very back of the envelope kind of numbers for several of these wharves, and we were looking at across the spectrum, $10 to $12 million to give you a sort of a sense of that. I'm not sure that at that time that we were necessarily thinking through resiliency as well as just repair of deteriorating conditions. So I don't want to lock any of us into that number. It's just way too premature. But those are the factors, Lucy, as best I can share with you now. The first step is this one. That will inform what we can get back from Beals and Thomas in terms of something substantive to be thinking about going to the Economic Council, and when. And that would then inform, do we press for something in 2018's annual town meeting or the subsequent year? Best answer I can give you at this point. Roger, do you want to add anything?
Well, just to, put a bow on it, basically what'll end up happening, if town meeting doesn't vote something this upcoming year, the next funding cycle, even if we wait until the August 8, 2018 funding cycle, that means this town meeting would have to vote to appropriate something. That would put us in a position where we'd have to wait almost a whole nother year to start something. And I think one of the things to consider is, I don't know that this funding source is going to exist in perpetuity. With any of these funding sources, they could go away. So it doesn't just potentially delay the schedule 2, 3, 4 months, 5 months. So it's probably a full year. And then I think it's always important to juxtapose that with the consideration associated with construction escalation on a larger project. And we'll present that. We'll have all that information for the advisory committee at some point. But to have $200,000 set aside to leverage $1 million sitting there is something that the town should strongly consider and have it available. If at that point we would have the project permitted and ready to go for the just after the May 19th approval of 2019, it gives us
That's May 19 of the bond council, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Not to be
But the
confused with
two-
our
but the
annual
August-
town meeting in late April.
Right, but that money, if that 20% is in place, we'd go into that application with the 20% set aside, ready to go.
You
So.
need that this spring to go into this year's deadline.
Next year's.
For even next year's deadline, for even.
way,
Yeah.
You're gonna have an ask.
Yes.
Correct. Correct. Right, it affects both, it would affect both cycles. Yep.
So I think the best answer is we'll be talking with you because I think there's going to be a conversation, but we're certainly hoping to engage your committee. I've met with your liaisons, Dan Coughlin especially, on this topic briefly, but I'm sorry he wasn't able to join, but I'm very appreciative that you were. All right. I think we've brought this topic of our agenda to a close. I want to thank town representatives who came with good questions.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry?
Just one last thing, just to make sure folks understand the next steps. I know you do, but for the sake of the audience, at your next meeting, the HDIC will be prepared to vote or take a position on the
A recommendation.
recommended elevation of the wall. So after that meeting, there'll be, the HAC will be in a position to make that recommendation to the Board of Selectmen, where after that we'll be able to get on this schedule is a different matter. So after today, next time these folks meet, they're going to be taking a position on something. So if there's any questions, concerns, you've got between now and then to bring them up, because we really need some action items taken care of. So just want to make sure I set those expectations for the audience.
Well, and Lonnie, that's why I suggested that perhaps Andrea, yourself, Mary, Emily, a meeting, here in town building to sort of go over some of the give and take here. Each of those committees have some jurisdiction and some capacity on this, and of course we fully understand, Eric does, that permitting, of course, will involve, as it always does for a project, coming back to those very same committees. But it's trying to be forward-looking and get ahead of it that urges me to want to do that.
And along those lines, that's a good point, because what I don't want to do, we have a certain amount of money allocated towards Eric's work, all our time. If you have a question, please don't wait till after we're done designing, figuring out what elevation, what it's going to look like, making a final recommendation to come to us and say, hey, there's something about this we need to talk about. Tell us as far in advance as we can understand those concerns, we can address those and make sure that we incorporate those into design where appropriate. Okay?
All right. So again, with thanks to Eric and Roger, I'm going to put the rest of our agenda up. Some may have interest in this historic discussion, some may not. Lucy, the Bathing Beach trustee report is next, if you wanted to get a sense from Chris Daly. Alan Perrault is not here this evening, but Chris is standing in for him. Roger and Eric, thank you.
You're welcome.
So we're at item 3B. And as I mentioned, Chris Daly is going to give us a quick sense. Roger and the Bathing Beach trustees have been working very hard to get the bids out for the new bathhouse. Do you want to stay for a few minutes just to cover this, or you want to get out of here, Roger?
Well,
So Chris,
we'll be brief, Roger.
you've got the floor.
We'll be.
Hey, Chris, move over this seat.
Can't hide the.
I know, please. Thanks, Roger.
You're welcome.
Okay. First, just an overall report on the summer and how it went. And I think we had a good summer. The good news is we had full staffing on the lifeguards. The previous years we had some issues with staffing and getting enough guards in place. But this year we split the staffing between college kids and high school kids. So the great thing was at the end of the summer, high school kids took the load after the college kids left early, and we actually got a lot more hours in for the high school kids than we did in the past, so that worked well. We also had lifeguards this year on the night of the fireworks. We're also on duty, a number of fireworks on the beach, and they had walkie-talkies and were in touch with the police department as needed. The bathrooms worked pretty well this summer, better than they did the previous summer, but it is apparent that the infrastructure in that bathhouse is dated, and we can't keep repairing it, and frankly, the new bathhouse can't come soon enough. Other operational stuff, the swim float came out on Monday. Thanks very much to the Harbor Masters Department for doing that. And previously last week, the swim lines and the float lines came in also. So our season is definitely over.
You'll continue to use the existing bathhouse for storage for the lifeguard stations and all that material?
Absolutely. The plan is to keep the bathhouse and use it for storage and potentially use it also to service the Hingham Farmers Market a little bit more in the future, and plans are coming together with that over time. So, speaking of the farmers market, we did, the farmers market was in the Bathing Beach parking lot every Saturday this summer, except for one, when the Hingham Nursery School's Touch a Truck event was held, so they've had a good summer. There is just one thing we need to talk about. There was a Touch a Boat event on the harbor in June, I think it was. And the farmers market representatives felt that the harbor, well, we were also subject on that day of, it was 80 degrees and sunny and an afternoon high tide. So it was the perfect storm at the beach. So everyone was there, and it was a bit crowded. And we're going to have some discussions over the winter about possibly staggering these events so they don't overlap each other. Obviously, we can't control the weather, but we can control the events. So we're going to discuss that over the winter. Onto the bathhouse. We are making progress. The RFP has been written for the bathhouse, and Roger, please step in if I've missed anything here, but as I understood, it will be posted on the central register for bidding this week, if I understood. We're a little bit delayed. We're waiting for some electrical stuff from the architect, if I recall, but it's going to be out there this week or the next week.
We've pushed it up just a couple of additional days to next week.
To next week.
24th.
Okay.
Yeah.
But the idea is to get it out there for a number of weeks, let the potential contractors get their bids in order, and then get the bids back. And as I understood, the idea is to hopefully have a contract in place Thanksgiving,
Yep.
around that place, and breaking ground in December.
Yep.
So,
So the delay of is a few days here, we'd hope to have the RFP out earlier, I know, but you don't feel that it changes the basic timetable of when you might be able to actually break ground and perhaps get the pad in?
Yeah, the hope is that if we have a milder winter, we'll work right through the winter, and that's happened. If we get one like we've had a couple of years ago, then work stops. So the contract is structured such that we're providing that latitude to the contractor to be able to work through the winter if weather permits, and hopefully it's a very tight budget. We're hoping that schedule, and we're hoping that we get the right bids in terms of value and also schedule. Yeah.
mm-hmm. Yeah, so the plan is to be open by next summer. We still have a memorandum of understanding in place with the concessionaire, the owner of Stars and Tosca and the Eatwell Incorporated, and he's ready to go as soon as we're ready. So,
Good.
Yeah, so the bathhouse, things are moving ahead. The only other thing to mention is there was when the remains of Hurricane Jose did hit the harbor, there was a bit of beach erosion in that same spot where we've had it before, where the armor stone wall hits the sandy beach. It comes around and just scours it out. So we're going to try to come up with a plan to stop that going forward, or at least remediate it as much as we can. As part of that, the DPW now is building a small ramp right at that spot on the top of the armor stone wall, so that they can as they bring the sand out of the boat ramp, put it in the dump trucks, and then dump it directly over the wall right there. And that project has started.
Rather than coming up the beach with
Yes.
one Caterpillar load of sand and.
And trying to spread it out.
I had seen that. It's the part of the barrier on the bathing beach parking lot. It's the absolute leftmost piece of the barrier, and they move the posts so that a truck could get through. It seems like a very smart solution.
Okay.
Can I just ask about, I know Alan had brought on Robin Plessier
Yes.
as a volunteer for some design consultation. And in a quick conversation I had with Robin, one of the end goals being how do we maximize rental potential of the common room in the future? And was her input on lighting and maybe shiplap on the wall, things that aesthetically inside will make it look more attractive and less utilitarian. Are those doable? Can they be budgeted for?
The two things I heard about, her strong suggestions were pendant lighting and wainscoting on the
Yes.
walls. And frankly, that works. The pendant lighting cost a few bucks, but it looks like they're trying to get it. But the wainscoting is a home run. Great idea. It's the right look for a harborfront building, and it's not expensive to put it in. So, and those definitely are being considered by the architect.
Great.
Maybe it's a broad question to both Roger and Chris. Other projects in town have constituencies, and at times those constituencies have come forward over and above town resources and said, gee, we really want this facility for kids or whatever, and have done some fundraising and made some things possible that might not otherwise have been possible in a tight contract budget. Has that been, Bathing Beach Trustees talked about that
We
at all?
haven't talked about it. I mean, we've always been in contact with the Friends of Hingham Harbor, and I don't know if they have a funding mechanism to drive our project or
Right.
contribute to it, but that's the first thing that would come to my mind on
Good.
that. So, but maybe we should probably reach out to them.
Thank you very much.
How about, but when you start breaking ground in December, I love signage, some type of construction project sign,
no,
which
like we
has
have
the
in the
visuals,
past.
No, that's a
like
great
we had
idea.
for the bridge.
Yep.
The bridge and then,
Because I think once, I know some trees are coming down, and I think that, people are very territorial about the harbor, to
It's
be
a great
able,
idea.
to have a big
sure.
under construction sign,
Yeah.
a reminder of the visual, estimate of the time. I know Carol was helpful in making those. But I just think, people forget, and then when they see the activity in there again, there will be questions again, and maybe some type of
We'll do the
social,
same thing we did last time. I
social
think that's-
media,
Yeah, that too.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. I should
be out in front of it.
I
Yeah.
think that's a good idea. We should definitely do that.
Yeah, no, we'll do it. I just made a note.
all right.
That's easy.
Anything else for Chris and Bathing Beach Trustees? I'll just be very brief. Tonight, there was also a Community Preservation Committee meeting downstairs. We were prepared to send a representative down to cover our proposed project, which is for a continuation of the Harbor Walk. This was begun with the section on the edge of the parking lot at the bathing beach. Last year at town meeting, the Bathing Beach Trustees got funds to continue the Harbor Walk toward the Grove and up into the Grove. The proposal for this year, a joint proposal by the Bathing Beach Trustees and the Harbor Development Committee, is to extend the walk the other direction in front of the bandstand and down to the parking lot where the boat ramp is, but also to tie in the walkways that would connect that harbor walk back to the snack shack and bathhouse. A big discussion at town meeting last year. Let's not have kids, going to get their ice cream cone, running across the parking lot with cars darting in and out. So actually, the planning board required that as part of the approved plan, there be walkways, only 5 feet wide, not as wide as our harbor walk, that would go along the edge of what we refer to as the Bandstand Parcel and connect from the bathhouse to the walkway and the beach out front. So that's the grant request. We've made a preliminary application in August. Final application was sent last week, and that's under consideration. I know there are a lot of requests of community preservation this year, and because we have committed to 2 large projects in prior years, there's not as much money to go around, but we are hopeful that CPC and the Selectmen and the Advisory Committee and the voters will be supportive of a continuation which will tie this whole area quite nicely together with a similar feel of walkways. Yes? Can you come up, please, or go to that mic? You just need to be heard. People want to hear your question, and there are...
So insignificant.
That's fine.
Signe McCullough, just a quick question, what will the walk look like? What will it be made of?
The walk is intended to be quite similar, and that's fine, thank you for the question. It's intended to be quite similar to the materials and the look of the walk that's at the edge of the parking lot to the bathing beach now. I have a diagram which we've provided to CPC that will be the subject of conversation if you want to come
Pass
up
that
and
along. I'll put
Sure.
it here.
Sure.
It's brick.
No, that's all I
take a
wanted to know.
give you a flavor of...
Brick or cement?
No, brick and part, Signe, the reason for that is Conservation Commission is quite concerned about permeability so that rainwater doesn't, we're not adding more asphalt here. This is a granite dust base and brickwork on top, which is exactly what is on the front of the bathing beach parking lot now. So very similar, and the expectation is going to be the same going, as I said, the other way through the Grove. This is all part of the big picture of We're building a harbor walk. It comes incrementally, but we're working on it. So,
Beautiful, thank you.
good, thank you.
Thanks.
If you pass that over, I'll put it to the folks at home.
Oh,
to see.
sure, no, that's great, Roger, thank you. So, Roger Fernandes is just going to let HCAM get a look at what was provided as the diagram for the Harbor Walk extension request that the Harbor Development Committee made of community preservation this evening. This will be the subject of conversations with CPC through the next month or two. And finally, we would hope to carry this discussion forward to town meeting 2018.
And just as a point of reference, where the pin tip is, that's the gazebo, the bandstand in Hingham Harbor, and here's the water.
And indicate where the bathhouse would be,
This is the
Deirdre?
new bathhouse.
Right. So what I referred to as the connector walkways are that section heading north-south, and then the little pieces coming off are to different entryways into the bathhouse. Thank you. That was a good idea, Roger. You know the technology in this room.
Thank you.
All right, so Ken Corson is not here, so we don't have anything from our harbor master, and we can go on to our one matter of new business, which is a request that the Historical Commission, thank you, Roger, for staying, helpful, made to this committee by letter, and we had been advised of this potential topic at our last meeting. So I'm going to let Signe McCulloch and your assistant or your fellow,
Sarah Caroline.
Sarah Carolyn. So again, why don't you come up if you would, and I think we've got some slides set up for you. I think why don't you present from there?
So, again, Signe McCullough, and I think the best way to go about this is to answer questions. I think you have Andrea's proposal, and you know the story, and if you...
Signe, I think I'm going to ask if you would, because this is a great opportunity for you as well.
Okay.
This is taped, and there will be an opportunity for people to go back and look at this meeting. So, yes, I know, and I sent the letter to my committee members earlier this week, but the people at home don't. So it might be worth just a brief context, harking back to particularly the approval 2 years ago, I think, to try to cite this
Right.
bandstand on Ragged Island, and just a little bit so people understand what this is about.
I can't find Andrea's, it's not, is it in here?
Oh, yeah. No, there it is.
I can give you this.
Oh, so, yeah, okay. It's okay. I have my own thing too. So, first, thank you for considering the Melville gazebo to be part of the permanent landscape of the harbor. And yes, the Melville gazebo is related to Herman Melville, which is quite interesting, and I'll get to that later. But the gazebo was formerly located in Melville Gardens, which, as you may or may not know, was the 20 to 40 acre plot in Crow Point in the vicinity of Hingham, the Hingham Yacht Club, and it was purchased in 1854. And we think that, by Sam Downer, we think that it was on the ledge up above Alice's Walk, which is, that little, the little peninsula that juts out. We're pretty sure about that. So, anyway.
That's the location right now, Signe, of a quite modern house? Is that the
Yes.
place that you're talking about?
Yeah.
You think it was out at
On-
the end of that point?
Exactly.
And the name of that cove that's next to it is Walton's Cove, is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
So anyway, just history. Sam Downer was an industrialist, and he bought the land with the intention of building a kerosene refinery on it. But later, he had a change of heart and decided to create a beautiful seaside open space where people could gather and enjoy boating and clamming. And anyway, it became a big, beautiful open space, and it was named Melville Gardens. And the Rose Standish Hotel was where the yacht club is, and the gazebo was part of this landscape. And and then when his son-in-law died, the whole thing, they closed down Melville Gardens and took down all the buildings, and it was a shame. Nothing was saved, but for this one little piece of the gazebo, which somebody found in their backyard many years later. And one of our past commission members, Mike Dyer, had the idea, because he worked closely with the Harbor Islands and the National Park Service. He had the idea to reconstruct it and put it on Ragged Island. But he moved to Florida, and the project lost steam and has kind of been in limbo ever since. So what we're proposing, but we did get the CPC grant, the $5,000 grant to do that. And the National Park Service was going to maintain it and help and clear the spot, make the foundation. So they lost interest when Mike Dyer left. So anyway, so we've had this, we don't have the gazebo, we only have the top of it, but Peter Bickford has agreed to reconstruct it to the best of his knowledge. I think you have the diagrams here.
Bob, that's on the projector now.
Yeah. As close to the original design as possible. And what he would do is he would build the pieces in his shop and then construct it down if your committee chooses to take the gazebo. He would build it down at the harbor. He said it would take about 3 weeks. He'd build the foundation. It would be beautiful. It'd be just like the picture. Anyway, so
Is this an actual picture of the gazebo?
Yes.
It is?
Yes.
Out on that point?
Yes. So
Okay.
does that look familiar to you since you're a boater?
Well, I know that point, because I rode by there, but there's a very large, very modern house
I
on top of
know.
that,
I
on that
know,
rock now.
and trees have grown and.
Sure.
But I did, when I was researching the history, I did notice that, in this particular drawing, there's so many gazebos. They were,
All over the place.
they dot the entire.
Am I
Melville
right
Gardens.
that it would be right about there?
That's the Hingham Yacht Club.
Or is that?
It'd be around the corner.
All right. See,
Yeah,
I'm
right
having-
in there.
I'm having trouble. Where's Walton's Cove? Is this Walton's Cove?
I don't have my.
Bear Cove.
This
Can you
is
see it,
Walton's
Sarah?
Cove.
Yeah, what is
Go
that
ahead.
going
So-
across?
Signe, is that Downer Ave?
No.
Is that 3A?
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm,
There's the Rose Standish.
Oh, I don't
Those
know.
are the gardens.
I would have thought that that's
think
Walton's
this
Cove,
is-
and
yeah, I
that's the
think this-
point. And therefore, it's, because I think then, it's very hard.
Yeah, it's different.
it is. It's hard.
Beautiful.
Yeah,
But you're right. Gazebo.
Yeah. Well, it was a very common, it was a bandstand kind of feature. We have a large gazebo at the shorefront now. It's
right,
the- it's
which
the-
I learned that Mike Studley built. But anyway, yes, it was a common turn of the century architectural feature. But and I thought also his vision was interesting, to connect the inner harbor with the outer harbor. Sort of similar with, on the same lines as what you're thinking of now. But anyway, so So we don't, he said it would take about 3 weeks to build. He said that's his lead time. He said spring would be great for him. If we like the idea of the grassy knoll, north of the, of the snack shack now, or what is it?
The Grove.
Called
The Grove.
Yeah, in the Grove, up on the hill. That seems fitting, with a beautiful view of the harbor, but we're not, we would just be so pleased if you would be interested in giving it a home, a permanent home.
So
And so what we would have to do is get approval from CPC to retain the $5,000 grant, and then ask them for a warrant article for town meeting to approve a new location for the gazebo. And once, this is all if you're interested. And then if that went well, then we would turn possession over to you, and management, possession, and
Maintenance.
yeah.
So are you ready for questions?
Yes, I think so.
I just do want to see, Bob, could we get the display on the desk, please, for a second? This is from Andrea's packet. I just want to confirm,
He's got it.
right, so in the packet we received from the Historical Commission, so it's a little bit different from what existed in that it's just the roof remaining. Have you not seen that? Okay, Andrea just gave that to us tonight. But that it looks like this is what may be what Peter Bickford would reconstruct if just the roof is the remaining historic part.
The point is that there's no
There's
sort
no
of sidewalls
sides, and there's
or-
no lattice work
It's-
underneath the roof.
It's really, well, no,
There
There would
could
be
be.
columns.
I
Well,
mean, we-
they don't have them right
Yes.
now.
Right,
but that's what their funding was intended to cover.
right. No, I think the funding is, because there's quite detail on the, building of the columns and the base, which I do want to just point out, it's pretty diminutive. It's,
It's not very big,
It's
no.
not very big at all.
No, it's only,
And I think that's important to emphasize, that
Yeah,
it's,
I mean, it's
just a little
12 feet
bit,
wide.
yeah,
That's
8
it.
feet tall, 8 feet clearance under the roof. Maybe, it's on a diameter base of, I think that's
If the
5.
inches isn't shown,
12.
but
On the second one, it
It
shows
showed.
12 feet. If you put a kind of a
Okay.
deck underneath.
Yep.
So, yeah,
Yeah,
so you can see right through it to the water,
yes, right.
which is important to keep in mind, for people who are opposed
So
to.
the question I have is from a historical nature or value, the only thing is the roof?
That's it, yes.
this is one of these similar, we sometimes have had in town, houses that have maintained, by saying, look, it's still the original house, they've kept one wall and they've replaced virtually everything else.
Right. So it
There's
does.
there's a little bit of that, but the point is, this is the original, this is the only piece of Melville Gardens that is,
Exists.
still exists.
Left.
It's pretty, you've got to have a good imagination, and you've got
Yes.
to be able to picture what this could look like in an appropriate location. That's one possible location, there are perhaps others. So that's the thrust. As I'm remembering CPC's process, their grants usually are for 2 years, and you need to act on it. So it was 2015 annual meeting, so that would have been from July 1 of 16 to July 1 of 17 to July 1 of 18.
Right,
And you'd
we're
need to
coming-
extend that and beyond.
Exactly,
Right.
yeah.
And then also, was there a specific site mentioned? I guess there was in the article in 2015 that it was going to go on Ragged Island.
Yes.
Okay.
But, yeah, that just, it just seemed impractical, and logistically, it became too difficult.
You want to make your point, Chris? Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think I agree with that. Access to Ragged Island is not easy.
No, I mean, you wanted the Historical Commission to know that even though your member has departed, that the town still has connections to the Park Service.
Yes.
Chris Daly is the town's representative to what is referred to as the Advisory Council for the National Park. It's a little bit in disarray right this minute politically because of some things happening in Washington vis-a-vis the Park Service and what advisory councils can do. But the point is that the committee still does exist and does have connections directly to Park Service people. So if your characterization that, really they lost interest as well, perhaps because Ragged is a difficult island to access. I don't, I know of high school kids who've gone out and used it for fishing or swimming, but it's not called Ragged for nothing. It's a pretty ragged island. It's a volcanic. It's stone. The stone is different even from the other islands. So it's a difficult site. I want to give my other committee members a chance, and I have a few questions.
So where exactly would you like to put this?
Well, we're amenable to wherever the Harbor Development Committee would like to put it. We had a preference, but we're not, we would just be thrilled that Harbor Development, I can picture it any number of places along the harbor. But as a committee, I think we did prefer the grassy knoll, but that
Okay.
was just a preference, not a
No,
demand.
I'm fine with, anywhere, but obviously the locations associated with historic, you gotta represent that it is historical artifact or it isn't or whatever, so whatever. I'm fine with anywhere in the harbor.
Do you want to,
No, I appreciate the opportunity to consider it. I think it's a natural home. It was in the harbor. I'd like to see it back. I'm thinking ahead about, signage, interpretive. Again, I like that it is a diminutive piece of its structure that, because as you know, that people are sensitive about any obstruction to the view in Hingham Harbor. So the fact that you can see through it, I was just thinking, wherever we situate it, perhaps, we plan ahead for some type of small interpretive sign that says, in the 1800s, if you looked in this direction, you might have seen, many of these small structures that were used for, gathering and a destination for a walk. But I think I hope we can make it work out because I think it would add to all of the developments we're trying to do to draw more people to the harbor.
Yeah, I think we considered cemeteries, World's End. We spoke with the trustees.
What was the reaction?
Sarah can speak to that. Would you like to talk about that? Because you spoke.
Sarah, again, would you just come up to the mic, please? You can both stay there, it's fine. We can do a tag team.
Hi, Sarah Carolyn. So I spoke quickly to the trustees about it, and they felt that, although they liked the idea of it, that they wanted to keep the World's End open and pure, and they didn't want to be introducing architectural components that, maybe weren't in line with the natural scape of World's End.
I think, aren't they undergoing a project trying to?
They just had a 50th anniversary event.
Right,
and
right.
a fundraising, which has been successful. They raised $250,000, and they're going to be restoring, with that, they're going to be restoring some of the natural landscape features, the Olmsted. Right.
Original plan, right?
And I think the only structures they're contemplating are a new entrance visitor center, a new guard shack and a new visitor center that will have a little bit more interpretive information. But they are very, careful. If this had been tied to World's End as a brewer or, the family, they might have had more interest. But that's very consistent with their approach to their other properties, so.
Yeah, we weren't surprised.
Okay. Chris, other questions?
Yeah, so just a comment of, so wearing my trustee of the bathing beach hat, I personally see placing this at the top of the Grove would be a great location, frankly. As Bill mentioned earlier, we have funding to run a walkway through the Grove, and we're trying to figure out, which direction, how to run it, and personally, I see this could be just putting my own 2 cents here, kind of the terminus of that walkway.
Right, I
They
was
have it up
thinking,
there.
yeah, a destination.
Yeah, but I think that'd be great. Other place, I'd see is, now, we haven't talked about developing the property, but is mobile station property is the other open one.
That's the one that struck me as another possibility. We have an open space, we acquired the property, we haven't been able yet, and I'm going to speak to that in a minute because it bears on your question, to weave it into a revised master plan. But that's another possibility that would begin to create something at that end of the harbor, whereas we are already adding some really very handsome new features with the bathhouse and concession stand and so forth. The couple of practical things that I just want to make note of. First, if, for example, the site were to be the area that you had in mind, then the request really will be to the Bathing Beach trustees, because that is, well, we think.
Yeah, hang on, yeah.
There are some, there've been some questions about the legalities of some of the parcels on the harbor, in terms of who controls them. The Bathing Beach trustees, it's a true trust, and it was understood that the Grove and the Bathing Beach parking lot and the Bathing Beach itself were part of that trust. There's a little bit of question, that arose surrounding that in conjunction with the survey work done when the siting was done for the new bathhouse, so my point is the jurisdiction is ultimately going to fall, well, where does it get put? And if it's at the mobile station site, it's pretty clearly Selectmen and Concom may have some, Conservation Commission may have some say here as well. You obviously, you folks and Historic Districts Commission would normally have a say. That also bears on your other requirement, which is, providing that Harbor Development Committee agrees to manage and maintain the structure going forward. If it's on Bathing Beach land, then the Bathing Beach trustees with their minimal budget would have to kind of work it into their budgeting. Similarly, if it's on town-owned property, one of the other parcels. In fact, Harbor Development Committee doesn't have a budget and doesn't have a staff. We're sort of the liaison between the town, the voters, and the staff of the town. Any work done at the Bathing Beach or at the boat ramp or Whitney Wharf are done by members from the DPW staff. So we can't make that commitment. We can make the same kind of commitment that we try to work very hard with the DPW so that our beach is clean and all of those things. But it couldn't be in any kind of agreement that Harbor Development Committee is committing to, making certain that this is maintained, because it wouldn't be on us. I'm just trying to be clear here. Mm-hmm. So those were the only sort of practical concerns. The other one that I wanted to mention, and it goes back to what I said earlier, the last master plan for the whole town was for the harborfront was done in 2007. We have been working around the edges of trying to update that, but that one costs $67,000, and we don't have that kind of money, and we're a little reluctant to go back to CPC or the town general coffers. We have secured some funding for some landscape assistance, partly in conjunction with the dollars appropriated by the town for the 3A Summer Street Transportation Corridor, and the general contractor there has a subcontract with a landscape design person for the harbor front of that highway project. Secondly, the Greenbush Trust, a year and a half ago, gave us control of about $10,000 for work on certain aspects of, well, it was Whitney Wharf, but it was also the landscape plan, to make certain that even though we haven't updated the full plan, we want to try to make certain that we are being intelligent about decisions so that we're not having different looks in different places in the harbor, so that we begin to have some consistency across the whole harbor. Ideally, placing this, is right smack there. I mean, you'd love to have a landscape architect with a big budget to sort of say, okay, where's the best place we could put this, and how would we do that, and how would the paths, and what kind of other sun structures and park benches and lighting would we have? We haven't gotten that far. Ideally, you'd work this effort into that, and with the limited funding we have, we may be able to do some of that collectively. The Harbor Development and Bathing Beach Trustees work very closely together. But at this point, I can't give you a
Right.
timetable.
I would think you could do what they did and walk up the hill and see what looked great.
What they did, meaning the
people who
put this.
Yeah. This is a great spot.
Well, I think
Take a picnic.
my sense is that probably the sense of the meeting here, because we don't have a quorum and I can't take a formal vote, but the sense of the meeting is we accept the proposal and we will take it under consideration, and so will the Bathing
bring it
Beach
to the other
trustees, and we
trustees.
often meet jointly. And we need to be in continued conversation with you, because certainly your hurdle point is
have a
what to do
deadline.
at town,
Yeah.
for town meeting, and the warrant will close on March, whatever.
20th.
So whether there's an article in, we need to have some movement by then.
Right, and it'd also be nice for Peter to know if this is a yay or a nay. And
Understood. Lots of things in the air, as you've
He's a
heard
busy
from the rest
man.
of the rest
3
of the meeting.
weeks out of his time is, but
It's very generous
Thank
on his
you.
See if
part.
we can get him some volunteers.
Well, thank you for coming before us and giving us some food for thought here.
our pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I think, gentlemen and lady, we are close to the end of our meeting here. I don't have anything in other matters. The main subject was this wharf discussion. I'm glad that we've got it on record and on tape. Lucy, I'm hoping maybe you could let Dan and your other, Evan, the other members know that they could see that presentation on closed circuit. It's going to be on HCAM, and we will work out with Bob and other representatives of HCAM, what timeframes that would be available, and try to make that known publicly in the newspaper and an announcement on the website. So that being true, I think we've had a number of questions from the public. The only other thing we need to try to do is to set a time for our next meeting. It's a little difficult because several of our folks aren't here, but I think we ought to try nonetheless, and at least have a sense for those here. Eric has told me that he cannot, the only date he could do is Tuesday, the 28th of November. I'm in Philadelphia. He could. That's the only day he says he could in November. I'm in Philadelphia and won't be back until that evening. So that date does not work for me. I was looking at Tuesday, the 21st of November, Wednesday, the 22nd, or Wednesday, the 29th. Tom and Deirdre, do you have, remember that Thanksgiving is Thursday, the 23rd.
Yeah.
The 21st is fine, so that's Tuesday?
Yep,
That's a
Tuesday, the
Tuesday.
21st works for me.
That works for you too?
Sure.
That is better. It's about a month from now. It's the date when I think we would try to reach a conclusion and a recommendation on elevation for the wharves.
Right.
And let's target that date, and we'll get that out to others not present.
Tuesday, November 21st at 7.
Correct, 7 PM.
Not 7:37.
7, no, it is generally 7. 7:30 was the one time because we wanted Deirdre to be here for Eric's presentation.
Yep, thanks.
I'd entertain a motion to adjourn.
Make a motion to adjourn the October meeting of the Harbor Development Committee?
Tom, got a second?
I'll second it.
And it'll be unanimous. Chris, I know you don't get to vote, but.
Keep it quiet.
Thank you, everyone. Bob, thank you
Thank you,
very
Bob.
much. And for the public who may see this presentation, I hope it will give you a better sense of an important decision that the town is going to make this fall. Thanks very much. Bob, thank you.